For a period, I had been conversing with a French girl whom I matched with on a dating app after my breakup. Initially, we exchanged text messages, but soon we progressed to frequent phone calls and video chats, almost every night. We had a strong connection, but she came from a strict family and still lived with them. When the idea of visiting her came up, she made it clear that she couldn't host me due to her parents' restrictions. I suggested sharing a hotel room, but she declined for the first few nights because her parents would react negatively. Being 23 years old and lacking financial resources, I decided to book a stay at a hostel near her location in Paris. During the 7-hour flight, knowing that I wouldn't be able to sleep as I never can on flights, I downloaded a couple of movies to watch. As expected, I couldn't sleep a wink, and upon landing and reaching the hostel via Uber, I hadn't slept for the past 24 hours. Exhausted and considering the 6-hour time difference, it was around 3 in the morning when I arrived. Luckily, this meant I could simply crash in the hostel bed without experiencing jet lag the following day. Upon reaching the hostel, which wasn't particularly pleasant, with its small size, a distinctive smell in the lobby, and an unenthusiastic front desk worker, I attributed these factors to the late hour and cut the worker some slack. I proceeded to the room assigned to me, which had 6 beds. 5 of them were unoccupied, but one had a guy sitting on it, engrossed in his laptop. He glanced at me briefly but returned his attention to the screen. I greeted him, but he didn't respond, seemingly engrossed in his work. Wanting to turn off the room light, I asked him if it was okay, and he looked at me with a vacant expression, without uttering a word. Assuming he hadn't heard me, I repeated my question, and he nodded oddly. Taking that as consent, I got up and switched off the lights, then quickly fell asleep due to my sleep deprivation. To my surprise, I woke up a few hours later in a nearly pitch-black room, unsure of what had disturbed my slumber. Looking around, I noticed that all the beds were empty, including the one where the guy had been sitting earlier. Curious about the interruption, I checked my phone and discovered it was 5 in the morning, in need of more sleep. I dismissed the guy's absence, assuming he had left, and attributed my awakening to external noises. Resettling on my side and closing my eyes, I could only hear the faint sounds of traffic from outside. Suddenly, the bed shook slightly, accompanied by a creaking noise from the metal frame. I heard a chilling, wheezing breath. I jolted in horror, as I saw a head peering over the edge of the top bunk, looking down at me in the bottom bunk. The guy from earlier was hanging upside down, with a sinister smile on his face, and his medium to long black hair drooping towards the floor due to gravity. It was an indescribably horrifying sight. Reacting instinctively, I screamed and fell off the bed, realizing the true nature of what I was witnessing. The guy sat up in the top bunk, continuing to gaze at me. In shock, I yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" while throwing something at him. He started laughing, emitting an eerie and unsettling sound. In a panic, I switched on the light and checked my belongings, making sure nothing had been stolen, all the while keeping an eye on him. Suddenly, I heard a click, and I looked at him as he held up his phone, having just taken a picture of me. He continued to laugh while staring at me. Something was seriously wrong with this man, but I couldn't determine if he was mentally unstable or had malicious intentions. I quickly packed my bag, went to the front desk, and demanded an immediate room change to one of the single private rooms. Despite explaining the situation and attempting to negotiate a reduced rate, the staff refused to accommodate my request, only promising to check the room I had been in. Feeling uncertain about whether any laws had been broken, I opted not to involve the police. However, I made sure to leave a detailed review of the hostel, expressing my dissatisfaction with the incident. The remainder of my trip went well, and I enjoyed my time with the girl I was seeing. Nevertheless, every time I returned to the hostel, I felt a sense of fear, dreading a possible encounter with that unsettling individual. The fact that he had a picture of me on his phone bothered me greatly, and although I'm not one to resort to physical confrontation, I wish I had taken action in that moment. I have been a solo traveler, opting to stay in numerous hostels as a way to save money, while also encountering fascinating new individuals. Throughout my travels, I have stayed in approximately 20 hostels, and about 90% of the time, I had positive experiences. However, my first truly dreadful encounter took place at a hostel called Freedom Traveler. It is important to note that the hostel itself wasn't entirely responsible for my terrible experience. Located in Rome, Freedom Traveler was my initial visit to the city, and being inexperienced with the surroundings, I heavily relied on Google Maps and locals. Finding the hostel itself proved to be challenging, as there were no exterior signs. Nevertheless, I eventually located it and entered through the prominent brown doors, where I was greeted by a friendly woman at the front counter. I had already made a reservation for a 4-person room, upon being shown to my room, which consisted of 1 bunk bed and 2 single beds, providing sleeping space for 4 individuals. I noticed the room had a green theme, but was not particularly spacious. The hostel worker informed me that there weren't many guests at the moment, which I didn't mind as it meant potentially more privacy in the room. The woman was consistently pleasant, and I appreciated her assistance. She showed me where I could store my luggage, which turned out to be a shed in the back garden area. I wasn't entirely impressed or confident in the security of the shed, so I decided to keep my luggage in the room, especially since I didn't have any highly valuable items with me. Exhausted from a full day of traveling, I changed clothes and placed my luggage under the bottom bunk bed. I settled down for a quick power nap. However, my rest was interrupted by a knock at the door, and 2 young men entered the room. They had noticeable Italian accents, and introduced themselves as Marco and Lucio, who were brothers. Marco, towering at around 6'4", and Lucio, approximately 5 feet 11, shared a resemblance in their faces, though they didn't appear particularly friendly. They seemed all right initially. While I was in the midst of my nap, they started conversing with me, and being polite and sociable, I engaged in conversation with them. Unbeknownst to them, I understood Italian, which they switched to while conversing privately. To my surprise, they began discussing and laughing about me, with Marco referring to me as a foolish white boy. I could have confronted them in Italian at that moment, but I chose to maintain the illusion that I didn't comprehend the language. Eventually, the brothers left the room, waving and smiling at me, It dawned on me that they hadn't brought their luggage into the room, leading me to believe they left it in the storage shed in the garden area. I spent some time mingling with other people in the garden, meeting a few friendly tourists also staying at the hostel for the weekend. Then, I set off to explore the city, heading towards the city center. After several hours and to food breaks, I returned to the hostel, anticipating some social activity in the lounge or garden area. However, to my surprise, there was no one around. Given that it was already 9 p.m., I decided to call it an early night. I don't recall exactly when I fell asleep, but I distinctly remember waking up. The room remained dark, but I could hear whispered voices. The brothers had returned. I remained still and listened to their conversation, which was still in Italian. One of them whispered something along the lines of "just grab it," or "are you gonna do it?" Although I wasn't entirely sure of the meaning, I had a hunch they were referring to my luggage. I waited to hear any sounds indicating that they were moving my luggage before revealing that I was awake. However, instead of that, I felt a cold and wet cloth, emitting a sweet smell, being pressed against my face. Reacting instinctively, I yelled and swatted it away. Turning to face me, one of the brothers stood over me. I shouted, demanding to know what they were doing. The man, whose identity I couldn't discern in the moment, attempted to subdue me by climbing onto the lower bed with me. I managed to kick him off and screamed for help. The other brother pulled him away, and they hastily left the room. I swiftly grabbed my bag and shoes, heading to the front desk for assistance. The worker on duty confirmed that he had witnessed the two individuals leaving, but had no record of them staying at the hostel. They were simply random locals, attempting to rob unsuspecting visitors. They had even resorted to trying to chloroform me. Naturally, I didn't continue my stay there after that incident. I assume they have since improved their security measures. But during my stay, it was evident that anyone could have walked in. If I hadn't been awake, I would have been rendered unconscious and robbed of my entire bag. Following this experience, I became more cautious when selecting hostels for my accommodation.